Welcome to our Jane's Walk called Chanels and Channels, a Jane's Walk inspired by Judith Little's novel, The Chanel Sisters. The 2021 Windsor Jane's Walk Festival takes place on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomie. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex peninsula and the straits, les détroits of Detroit. This Jane's Walk is hosted by the Book Girls, Melinda, Candace, and Lisa. We are a local book club. We've been together for approximately 15 years. We have wonderful discussions. We read wonderful novels and eat wonderful food and drink great wine. So it's been a pleasure to work with these ladies on this project. Now, our inspiration behind this Jane's Walk is the novel The Chanel Sisters by Judith Little. This novel was released this January 2021, so it's quite new actually, and I decided to read it. It's my cup of tea. I really like historical fiction. Anything about the Chanel sisters seems to be fascinating. And this particular novel is based off of their life story and just based off of the two sisters. So we have Gabrielle, who is also known as Coco Chanel, and we have her younger sister, Antoinette. Now, this story is narrated by Antoinette, so we really get her perspective. As we're reading through the novel, everything is great, very exciting things happening, but about 3/4 of the way through the novel, we discover something quite interesting. Antoinette Chanel, after the First World War, met and fell in love with a Canadian soldier, and I just thought that was interesting. As they were telling us more information about this soldier, we figure out that, in fact, this soldier is from Windsor, Windsor, Ontario. And to bring it even further, Antoinette Chanel then moves to Windsor. And I could not believe that this happened and that I had never heard of this. This would have been in 1919, during Prohibition and during that time, it was so exciting. And here we had one of the Chanel sisters living in our neighborhood. When I read that, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I had to do some quick research to figure it out. And sure enough, it was true. That's when I contacted the girls from Book Club and I'm like, you have to read this. And somewhere along the way, you are going to read a fact that's going to blow you away. I wanted to see if their reaction was the same as mine. So does anybody want to share what happened when you read that, or what did you think was going to happen? I mean, I was making kind of a big deal about it, and I was like, maybe I'm making too much of a big deal, and it's not really a thing. So what did you girls think?
Well, when I was reading it, I was waiting for some twist to happen, and I kept texting Lisa and saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And she's like, no, believe me, when you get there, you're going to know. And I assumed that maybe Coco or Antoinette dated a member of the royal family or something that was kind of scandalous. And when we got to that part where Antoinette declared Windsor, I was just blown away. And I wondered if it was true, because I've never heard of this before. So it was a fun twist.
Absolutely.
When you were talking about it, I kept thinking, oh, it's going to be something weird, like, or unusual, like one of the Chanel sisters is a man or something like that. And so, and then again, same as Candace, I thought when I got there and went, oh, really? She's from Windsor, Ontario? And like you, I didn't really believe it and had to actually do a little, quick searching to find out, in fact, it was true. And that kind of then led to, hey, we could do a Jane's Walk on this, because there must be all kinds of places that she would have seen and that we could talk about. So here we are.
Yeah, and that's the story. That's the inspiration behind this walk. So this is the little passage in the book. This is Antoinette talking, and this is when she first met Oscar. So his name was Oscar Fleming. There was an underlying ease about him, a confidence that must have come from having lived knowing he could die the next day. He was so open, so straightforward and romantic. Every day he sent the most beautiful bouquets to the boutique. In the evenings, he took me to dine at the most expensive restaurants, to dance at the nicest hotels. He was an aviator and an officer, so we were always given the best tables. We stayed out late, often until sunrise. Windsor, I repeated when he told me the name of the city he was from in Canada. It sounded so genteel. Like the city in England, he said, the home of Windsor Castle. Is there a castle in your Windsor? I asked. There will be. How do you like your castles, Queen Antoinette? With or without a moat? So sure enough, they fell in love and they were married November 11th, 1919 in Paris. So here we have from the Border City Star, which was the newspaper of the time back in the day here in our area, the wedding announcement of Oscar Edward Fleming to Antoinette Chanel. So here on the left, we have a picture of Oscar Edward Fleming. That would have been a little bit later. He was married when he was 21. So this is obviously a little bit later than that. And then here on the other side, we have a photo of Antoinette Chanel and her aunt Adrienne, who was more of a peer to Antoinette because the ages were pretty close together. So this is the little announcement that Windsorites would have read.
And I like the reference there to the country chateau in Biarritz,
Mm-hmm.
which was the shop.
Yeah.
The Chanel shop in Biarritz.
Yes. So the couple, the happy couple, found their way to Windsor. They arrived in Windsor in December of 1919. They crossed over on the SS Empress of France, and they decided to stay with Oscar's parents. And Melinda, you're going to tell us a little bit more about his parents in a bit. But of course, you know, just like any city, we had to announce this big arrival. Border City Star again with the headline, Lieutenant Oscar Edward Fleming returns to border with French bride. And throughout this article, it tells us a little bit about their information, but something very interesting at the very end, if you take a look, it says, Lieutenant Fleming and his bride crossed on the SS Empress of France. They were on a special train directly behind the one wrecked near Odawa, Maine, in which so many persons were killed or injured. So we don't have a lot of information about that particular event, but it sounds like that whole event there would be a whole other talk, right? The survival of this passage over, and thank goodness they did make it to Windsor. Now, upon her arrival, Windsor was recovering from a pandemic. In 1918, so the year before, Windsor was faced, just like the rest of the world, with the Spanish flu, also known as the 1918 flu. So during that time period in 1918, it was a very bad flu, which resulted in a lot of deaths. Similar today to today, a lot of schools and churches, dance halls, theaters, everything was closed down. There was a lockdown, so they went through it also. Public meetings were capped at 25 and kids were told to stay in their own backyard. So they couldn't even go out and play. And this lasted all the way until 1920. So when Antoinette first came to Windsor, they would have been faced with this in Paris as well. So it was nothing new to Antoinette and to Oscar, but the worst had been over. Things had already started to open up again. So that was very encouraging. However, there was another event that happened, and this was smallpox. Smallpox being quite a bit more serious than the 1918 flu. Of course, we know the story of smallpox that goes back all the way to colonization, how it wiped out Indigenous peoples and such a big tragedy. Well, smallpox was still going around even in 1919. There had been a vaccine created just a few years prior to this, and many people were vaccinated. If you guys are familiar with the big circular scar that people have on their upper arms. So that would have been the smallpox vaccine, but not everybody got it, and not everybody, it wasn't forced upon people. So in 1919, in December, actually the same month that Antoinette arrived to Windsor, there was a case of smallpox in Windsor. And that was very scary because approximately between 50% and 70% of people infected by smallpox would pass away. So the death rate was quite high, and it was a very, very scary disease to get. Because of that, schools were already going to be closed because of Christmas break, but the Ministry of Health decided that for children to come back to school, they would have to be vaccinated. So here you see some of the headlines that were in the local paper. Forced vaccination of all school children is ordered by the Ministry of Health. One case of smallpox discovered in Windsor influences Board of Health to take preventative measures. Over here in the center, vaccination scar will admit pupils. Where certificates cannot be obtained, evidence will be accepted. So I suppose that's one good thing about the scar that they received from these vaccinations. If they had lost their certificate indicating that they had received the vaccine, they could just sort of, pull up their sleeve and show the circular scar. That was enough to get them back into school. And then finally over here, the last headline, Education Board aids vaccination order of Ministry of Health. So it was quite drastic, but they got it done. Most children got the vaccine, and some adults got the vaccination as well during that time. But again, not everybody decided to get the vaccination. And then if we fast forward a little bit, now Antoinette would have been gone by this time, but in 1924, so a few years later, Windsor did in fact suffer an outbreak of smallpox. Overall, 67 people were infected and 32 died. The biggest outbreak, actually, most of these people infected with smallpox were all attending the funeral of a man named Gordon Deneau. Now, Gordon was thought to have died from the flu, but in fact, later on, it was discovered that he had smallpox. So a lot of his family members were probably already infected when the funeral took place. And at the funeral itself, that's kind of where everything was spread. So unfortunately and horribly, 21 close relatives of Monsieur Deneau died because of that one funeral service. So quite tragic. This is known throughout Canada as one of the biggest smallpox outbreaks during that time. So it's in all the medical books. It's recorded everywhere. If you do any type of research about smallpox in Canada and outbreaks, that one pops up. So it was quite devastating to the community. So that's what Antoinette would have come into. So, but thank goodness it didn't last forever. It cleared up, and then
on we go. So here we are, 1920. So actually, Antoinette arrived in December of 1919. And in the spirit of Jane's Walks, which are about both history and neighborhoods, we've got a picture on the left, a postcard from the Southwestern Ontario Digital Archive of Olette Avenue looking south. And now on the other side, a picture looking north. And we can see Detroit there in the distance, but Windsor, Olette Avenue was obviously a hub of activity even then. So she would have arrived to a scene much like we see on the left, lots of businesses, lots of people, a very busy, bustling community and bustling neighborhood. Now, her father-in-law was Oscar Ernest Fleming. So she married Oscar Edward Fleming, and her father-in-law was Oscar Ernest Fleming. And this gentleman must have been a very imposing figure for anyone, least of all, a former orphan and a francophone who's newly arrived in Canada. But Antoinette herself had been a very successful business owner. And so in Paris, and she brought her family up from rags to riches. So you might have thought she'd have some things in common with a businessman like Oscar Ernest Fleming, but doesn't appear to have been the case, as we'll see throughout the walk. But courtesy of the Windsor Public Library, we know some things about Oscar Ernest Fleming, and we're going to learn some more as we go. But he was the last mayor of the town of Windsor and the first mayor of the city. He campaigned on a pledge that he would turn the town into a city and got that approval from Queen Victoria. In addition to serving as the first mayor of the city, he also was on a number of boards and associations in the municipality and acted as a director for companies, including the Windsor Truck and Storage Company, which of course we know is a beautiful building that's still standing. And for anyone who doesn't know, the letters KC stand for King's Council. And we don't see too many KCs anymore because we haven't had a king in some time. But so most lawyers that have this honorific have QCs, or Queen's Counsel. And what it means is that historically it meant you were authorized to prosecute cases on behalf of the king or the monarch. But in Ontario, it meant that you were recognized by your peers as a leading lawyer. Ontario abolished that honorific of King's Counsel or Queen's Counsel several years ago. So the only people that you see with names that have QC after them are people who are very, very senior practitioners now. Jumped ahead too fast. So when Oscar was the mayor, Oscar Ernest was the mayor, he was the mayor in this building on the left-hand side, which was formerly the Central Public School. And it had been turned into a city hall, and it operated as the city hall actually for a very long time. And it was demolished in 1955 when they built the city hall that existed in between these two buildings, the one that the blue cladding that we would all recognize. And then this new one on the right-hand side was built in 2018 to replace the old one. And if you go to the park, Senator David Kroll Park is there. And if you go to that park, sort of to the left of the new City Hall building, you'll see a beautiful reflecting pond that has plaques for the different buildings that have stood at that site at various times. There was a former barracks, then there was the Central Public School stood at that site. And you also, if you're looking sort of towards yourself from City Hall, and you look straight across towards Detroit, down Emancipation Way, and there are sculptures on both the Windsor and the Detroit side recognizing the Underground Railroad at that same site. So the Oscar Fleming family was a big family. So Oscar Ernest is up there in the background, and then Oscar Edward, our hero, is got the red circle around him in the foreground. And there were a lot of children in that family. It was a very big family. And they used to live at the 217 Sandwich Street, which is now Riverside Drive. And the corner where they lived, where that house was where the Portofino now stands. So, and if you look at this beautiful house, it's gone, unfortunately, but you can see how clearly prominent and important they were. I mean, you can kind of see from the size of the window there on the right side, and the size of the porch, and the leaded glass in the door, and the beautiful stone columns. They were quite a prominent family, and their house was situated in quite a prominent location. Now, according to the fictionalized version in the book, Oscar and Antoinette, when they came from Paris, wound up living in Oscar's old room in the house. And what we don't know if this is accurate, but the author's description is quite compelling. She says, Oscar's parents' house was a solid, imposing home where we were to all live together. It was touching to watch his family welcome him. I stood to the side as his siblings crowded around him. Our room was his old room, a boy's room, decorated with tennis trophies and school pennants and clippings of airplanes tacked to the walls. Now imagine you're a businesswoman in your 30s coming from Paris, and you're going to be living in a room with tennis trophies. Oscar Ernest, the father was a businessman, as we know, and a lawyer, and his brother Harwood was a druggist, a pharmacist. And one of the buildings that the family owned was called the Fleming Block, and it stood at the corner of Chatham and Alette, roughly where the Royal Bank now stands. We don't have a picture of the older building, but we do have this picture from SWOTA of the inside of the pharmacy, the drugstore where Harwood had his drugstore. And then we also see, as Antoinette was coming to Canada, she was, and Oscar Edward was telling her what to expect. She says, soon I would be Mrs. Oscar Fleming, wife of the barrister son of one of Windsor's most prominent families. Oscar said there would be teas, dances, at-home parties at country clubs, trips to Detroit, tennis tournaments, a game called bridge. His family had a yacht and a country house. And I actually stumbled on this country house rather accidentally up in Goderich. So this picture in the middle is a photograph that I took of a house known as the Ridge. And on the left, we've got a picture of it from a local Goderich magazine, a close-up. But over here on the right, as you stand at one side of the harbor looking across where you see this house, here we see that in 1913, Oscar Fleming, a Windsor lawyer and friend of Henry Ford, was the next owner of the Ridge, and he used it as a summer home and had a 9-hole golf course added to the property. So he was certainly wealthy enough and important enough to be able to own a piece of property quite this prominent in Goderich. Unfortunately, we know that he lost the property in 1929 due to losses suffered in the stock market crash that year. Now, Oscar Ernest Fleming actually was a really important person. So when Antoinette was musing about the idea of marrying into royalty, in fact, she kind of was. Oscar Ernest Fleming, in addition to having been the mayor of the town and then the city of Windsor, is very, very important to the local geography and industry. So if we look on the left-hand side here, the channel between Windsor and Belle Isle, between Riverside Drive there and Belle Isle, is known as the Fleming Channel. And it was named after Oscar Ernest Fleming because of the work that he did on the St. Lawrence Seaway, the St. Lawrence Deep Waterway, it's called in the plaque. So this plaque is from Alexander Park, which is at the end of Strabane Avenue and Riverside Drive. And so he was very instrumental in the work to create the St. Lawrence Seaway, and the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up international shipping traffic into the heart of North America, right, all the way from Montreal to Chicago. And the work they've been working on this project since the days of European colonization. Basically, from the first time anybody arrived at Quebec, they were trying to figure out how to have international traffic into North America. But the push for the modern seaway ramped up in between the First and Second World War, and that was when Oscar Fleming was really involved in it. He died in 1944, so he did not live to see the opening of the seaway in 1959. But in 1958, you can see they acknowledged his role in the development of the seaway by naming the channel after him.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the fashion world in Windsor around the time that Antoinette moved to Windsor. So we're going to start with this quote from Coco. A girl should be two things, classy and fabulous. And we know Antoinette had easy access to top fashion designs and even had her hand in creating them. But how would Antoinette maintain her classy and fabulous style in Windsor? In the book, Antoinette describes introductions with the Flemings. My clothes that were so fashionable in Paris seemed frivolous here, ostentatious or worse. So feeling overdressed and out of place with her new family, Antoinette would soon learn which tools the modern Windsor girls had in hand for achieving their fashion and beauty goals, making them classy and fabulous. So the Modern Girl Digital Archive is a project that came from the University of Windsor's History Department. Dr. Christina Burr and her team collaborated on creating a community resource in 2019. And this archive paints a picture of what life was like for the young Windsor woman in the 1920s and 30s. This collection features 7 themes: beauty, consumption, and fashion, working girl, education, leisure activities, sports, girl problems, and community chronicles. The Community Chronicles features interviews with local modern girls who grew up during that time. And what was really interesting for myself is when I was reading some of these interviews, there was a lady named Elmira St. Ange Frenette who was interviewed. And that name rang a bell. So it turns out that Lisa and I grew up with Elmira's granddaughter, Anna. And Anna said that she still talks frequently with her grandmother, and she will be celebrating her 105th birthday this summer.
Wow.
So happy birthday, Elmira. So through this archive, we learn where the modern Windsor women shopped. The C.H. Smith Company, better known as Smith's, was owned by Charles Henry Smith. He opened his first store in 1914 on Pitt Street East. And pictured is Smith's in 1920. So we can imagine Antoinette browsing the storefront windows and wandering through the store. In the coming years, Smith's would expand and open a beauty parlor with 7 barbers trained in the latest styles, like the bob haircut. Smith's hosted a home sewing week each February, and this event taught girls how to sew the latest fashions if they could not afford to buy them. Smith's continued to grow with 3 store locations in downtown Windsor and more around the county, including Leamington, Amherstburg, and Essex. And in fact, my grandmother, Gladys Levi Collins, was the manager of the Essex location for a few years in the 1940s. If you wanted a larger selection of fashion designs and beauty supplies, you could catch the ferry and cross the Detroit River to shop at the exquisite J.L. Hudson department store. Hudson's was located on Woodward Avenue in the heart of downtown Detroit. It featured 23 stories of retail heaven, including a bridal salon. At the time, Hudson's was the 3rd largest department store in the United States, after Macy's in New York and Marshall Field's in Chicago. So 101 years later, here we have 2 pictures of Pitt Street East, and Smith's storefront is now a parking lot behind the Holiday Inn Express Waterfront Hotel, which is located on Riverside Drive. And the parking lot features a beautiful mural of Pitt and Olette in 1927. This was a fun surprise to see while I was walking around this area. I took this photo of the mural today, so that didn't leave me much time to do some research, but in the bottom right corner of the mural is a list of artists and the year 2004. So I think it's fair to assume that this was completed by these talented folks in 2004. The Border City Star was the local newspaper when Antoinette arrived in Windsor. In 1918, W.F. Herman and Hugh Graybeale purchased the existing daily newspaper, the Windsor Record, and rebranded it the Border City Star. It was in circulation until 1935. When Antoinette arrived in December 1919, she could have purchased a copy for 2 cents. And that same month saw an average of over 15,000 copies circulated daily. Smith's advertised daily in the Border City Star. The full page ad was known as Smith's Daily Page and featured sales and new arrivals. In this ad from 1933, we can see Smith's echoing Coco Chanel's expertise. As Chanel says, a coat takes its smartness from its fabric. The Border City Star also featured fashion news in articles. And this clip from 1921 highlights Coco's determination to keep skirts short at 12 to 14 inches from the floor.
Shocking.
The modern Windsor girl might also rely on beauty tips published in the Border City Star. Beauty Chats with Edna Kent Forbes was a daily column that offered advice on beauty, fashion, and dieting. Readers would often write and ask for advice on personal beauty and social challenges. Another noteworthy column was Dorothy Dix, and it was written by U.S. author and journalist Elizabeth Meriwether Gilmore. Dorothy Dix was published in over 200 newspapers. And this clipping from January 18th, 1933, Dorothy warns, college degree cuts girls' chances of marriage in half. And she explains, here's a quote from her, "Still, another reason why the college girl so often fails to marry is because her technique in husband hunting is so poor. She may understand higher mathematics, but she doesn't understand men. She may speak Latin and Greek, but she doesn't speak soft talk. She appeals to a man's head instead of his heart." Dorothy also points out that a man may feel intimidated by an educated lady.
Wow.
There's lots to dig into there, isn't there?
Oh yes, that's a whole other Jane's Walk. Now that we've talked a bit about where Antoinette and the modern Windsor girl would have found her clothes and beauty tips, we're ready to hit the town and have some fun. So, leisure life for the Windsorites. Windsorites worked hard and they played hard. In the warmer months, Boblo Island was a destination for picnickers who would board a ferry and travel 18 miles down the Detroit River to Amherstburg, Ontario, my hometown. While researching Boblo, I came across this quote from the Windsor Public Library. Boblo is a mispronunciation of the island's original name, Bois Blanc, which means white woods, in reference to the white birch trees that grow on the island. Now, I did not know that. Did you ladies know this?
I knew it, but I think the only I was raised French Canadian. I went to French schools growing up, and we kind of took pride in knowing that the proper pronunciation of Boblo was Bois Blanc. So I can say, but thanks to our excellent school system, yes, I did know that.
It's certainly an interesting thing moving here from another part of Canada to come across all these peculiar pronunciations, like the Bois Blanc suddenly becomes Boblo, or even I do it now pronouncing Ouellette as Olette Avenue.
Yeah, it's the evolution of the language, or of pronunciation anyway.
So this aerial shot was taken in 1920. So this was the island as Antoinette would have known it had she visited. A visit to Boblo may have included a romantic stroll through the lovely gardens, a game of baseball with friends, and a day at the beach, like this postcard from 1921. They may have boarded the St. Clair or Columbia and paid 55 cents for each adult ticket. In the coming years, Boblo would continue to evolve into a summer vacation destination and a theme park, which again could be like a whole other Jane's Walk. In 1913, Henry Ford commissioned the construction of the famous Boblo Dance Pavilion, one of the largest of its kind worldwide. In chapter 72, Antoinette explains, "On the dance floor, Oscar and I could close our eyes, nothing but music in our heads. We could sway in each other's arms. For a few hours every night, we were back in Paris at the end of the war, remembering why we'd fallen in love."
Oh.
The Masonic Temple was another dancing destination located in downtown Windsor on the corner of Olette and Erie Avenue. It was built in 1922, and the debut dance took place on February 1st of that same year. Today, many brides and grooms host their wedding reception in the grand ballroom that can accommodate up to 350 guests. Antoinette and Oscar may have seen a picture at the Lowe's movie theater, and it was located on the corner of Pelissier and London, which is now called University Avenue. It opened on December 30th, 1920, and sadly Lowe's flopped, and it was sold in 1923 and rebranded as the Capitol. The Capitol has exchanged hands and evolved over the years and is now the home of the Windsor Symphony Orchestra. So shortly after Antoinette landed in Windsor, big things were happening across the border in the United States. Within weeks of her arrival, the US government enacted the Volstead Act, which banned the manufacturing, sale, and movement of all intoxicating beverages. On our side of the river, the Ontario Temperance Act had been in place since 1916, But in December 1919, the federal government of Canada repealed its wartime efforts and opened the liquor floodgates, leaving the provinces to handle the problem of wet versus dry. So this left a lot of loopholes, and rum running became a common hobby as a result. So Ontarians could not buy, sell, or gift liquor or transport liquor within the province, but Ontarians could produce and export liquor and consume liquor in a private dwelling.
So we're both of you. I know I've teased Lisa a few times about being pro, the rum running, but actually, Candace, your family's been here forever too. You must have been rum runners too.
Yeah, my grandmother was my great grandmother was in St. Louis, and they lived somewhere along Riverside Drive, and there's some family secrets, I guess, around that. So something to look into, I suppose.
Yeah, they probably hung out with the LeBeoufs too. They,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's common to see this book, The Rum Runners, on coffee tables across Windsor and Essex County. If you don't have a copy, get one. It's a fascinating prohibition scrapbook written by Marty Gervais. And Marty is a craftful storyteller, and this book takes you back to prohibition days in Windsor, Detroit. We could spend all day talking about this subject alone, but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep it simple and share a few statistics that Marty highlights. So this area was known as the Windsor-Detroit funnel because of the amount of booze that went through it. It was estimated that $40 million of booze crossed the funnel annually. And 80% of all liquor smuggled into the United States from Canada came through the funnel. And finally, around 25% of the population living near the Detroit River were involved in smuggling.
Wow. Team effort.
And of course, we have Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, and it's still here. Hiram Walker was an American distiller who set up shop just outside of Windsor in an area which was later known as Walkerville. When the US started talking about temperance in the 1850s, Walker didn't waste any time and purchased land in Canada so he could continue producing whiskey. This postcard is from 1915. And Walker did have pipelines running from the distillery to his livestock barns at Tecumseh and Walker. And because of this, rumors started circulating that Walker installed a pipeline running under the river to his property in Detroit.
When I look at this picture, and of course, Lisa, you got married in that building there on the right-hand side. But all those buildings on the left are gone now. There's just the silos are still there, but the rest of it is, I guess, now part of the park. It was a pretty fun time at your wedding.
Yes, it was.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Should have included a picture. In chapter 72, Antoinette describes a string of roadhouses all along the Windsor side of the Detroit River came alive at night. The Island View Inn, the Chappelle House, the Rendezvous, the Edgewater Thomas Inn, speakeasies. That's what Oscar called them. Places with secret passages, hidden wine cellars, lookouts and spotters, and buzzers to warn if the police were on their way. In a matter of minutes, green felt gambling tables were folded up, drinks poured out, bottles hidden away. This postcard of the Island View Inn is from 1910. It was located across from Belle Isle near the end of the Fleming Channel. On land, it was at the end of Lausanne Road and Sandwich Street, which is now known as Riverside Drive today. It later became known as A-Bars. This speakeasy was equipped with a buzzer system that was connected to 4 other roadhouses along the river, and it was used to alert that the police were on a raid and to hide the contraband. Al Capone, Babe Ruth, Detroit Tigers, some New York Yankees, and a lot of other celebrities are noted for frequently visiting this roadhouse. And it was demolished in 2016.
So do you know why it's called A bars? I mean, when I moved here, I thought it was just a joke. It was a bar.
No, I don't know why it's called A bars.
It's another one of our strange Windsor French words. It was A bears. It was owned by the A Bear family, and it just became A bar.
Of course.
But you know, looking at this postcard, and you see the people standing on the pier, and you can kind of see why when Antoinette says, you know, my clothes didn't make any sense here. And this is only a few years before she moved to Windsor, and look at what they're wearing.
Yeah.
It's nothing like what you think of when you think of Chanel.
Right.
No, that's for sure. Antoinette was visited by an old friend named Arturo. He stayed with the Flemings during his time in Windsor. And here's an interaction between Antoinette and Arturo. That night, Arturo and I stood on the dock outside the speakeasies in the cold, the river frozen over, Detroit blinking in the distance. They call it the Paris of the Midwest, I said flatly. Is it? No.
So Windsor is, or with Detroit rather, is known as the Paris of the Midwest, or has been known as the Paris of the Midwest. And so we wanted to find out a bit about why he would have told her that and what it really meant. So there's a couple of reasons, and we're indebted to WDET, Detroit Public Radio, for helping us with this. So in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Detroit was emerging into an economic and culturally prosperous town. We see the emergence of the Dodge brothers and the Ford family, and the beginning of the auto industry. And it was also, because it was booming, developers were building new buildings in the Parisian style, the Beaux-Arts style, or the French Gothic style. And so it's trying to become a big, important city. And although it has French history everywhere, like Windsor does in terms of the names of the streets, and even the name of Detroit is Détroits, it wasn't until 1805. How did I get to 1915 from 1805? 1805, there was a fire. And after the fire, Judge Augustus Woodward, after whom Woodward Avenue is named, came up with this design we see on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, we have Paris. We're looking down on the Arc de Triomphe and the Champs-Élysées. And what we have is a very medieval city design, very tight streets, very angular streets, not very square blocks. And what we have on the left, or the right-hand side rather, is Woodward's design, where he's kind of mimicking the Parisian wheels, spokes coming out of the wheel of what's called Grand Cirque there, and becomes Campus Martius. But then we have big wide avenues, and we have square block construction. So we have kind of the modern elements being impressed upon a sort of Parisian basic design. So this is one of the reasons people often think of as the Paris of the Midwest, because of this attempt to design this in 1807. Now, some of this was built, but not all of it. So we see some of that circular spoken wheel construction in Detroit, but they didn't go as far as the original plan had intended. But the other reason that it's called the Paris of the Midwest is actually, historically, it was called the Paris of New France. And that reference is from, on the right-hand side, the left-hand side, we have Antoine Lomé de la Motte Cadillac, who was the founder of Fort Pontchartrain, or Pontchartrain. And we have over here, we have the Louis Philippot Comte de Pontchartrain, who was the Comptroller General, which is basically the banker to the King of France. And Cadillac is writing to Pontchartrain to tell him all about how wonderful Fort Detroit is, because of course he wants to buff himself up and make himself look very important and possibly get money. And in his letter in 1705, he writes this phrase, "Ce poste sera le Paris de la Nouvelle France et toutes les nations viendront s'y établir, meaning will become the Paris of New France, and all the nations will come to live here or come here to Detroit. And that's actually true. Between the auto industry, between the location, between the relationship with Windsor and Detroit being one of the most important border crossings in North America, the nations of the world have come here. But I'm not sure that meant it was the Paris of New France. And you have to imagine when Antoinette made that comment about, is it the Paris of the Midwest? No. She's really thinking Paris isn't a set of street designs. And Paris isn't something you just get to say, I'm Paris now, and that's it. Paris is a feeling. Paris is a culture. Paris is millennia of history. Paris is being conquered by the Romans. Paris is emerging from the First World War. Paris is, the Revolution. Paris is the Third Republic. Paris is a lot of things that Detroit certainly in 1920 wasn't. And so it might have been what they wanted to be, but it certainly wouldn't have been the kind of Paris that she understood it to be.
Now, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And Antoinette only stayed in Windsor for approximately a year. There are various reasons why. We'll explore those. We're not going to give, the novel away. We would encourage everybody to grab a copy of that novel, The Chanel Sisters by Judithe Little, for all of the drama. But here are a few reasons why, without giving anything away, why things didn't work out for Antoinette. First of all, the marriage would have been seen as, right from the beginning, quite scandalous for many reasons. First of all, Oscar, let me read the quote first and put it into context. So this is coming from the book. His father was a barrister, a leader in Windsor, a former mayor who'd presided over the town when it was given city status by Queen Victoria. Oscar, one of 11 children, was to follow in his footsteps. He had attended the Royal Military College in Ontario, trained to be a pilot with the Royal Flying Corps. Once back in Canada, he'd go to Osgoode Hall to study law. Clearly, the Fleming family was one of means and privilege, and of course they were. However, they were not quite as, too accepting of Antoinette. First of all, Oscar was 21 and Antoinette was 31. That would have been seen as scandalous. If it would have been reversed, where Antoinette would have been younger and Oscar would have been older, probably would have been acceptable. But here, I think the parents viewed Antoinette as this modern French woman kind of, taking advantage of him. And they were kind of alarmed by that. When Oscar left for law school in Toronto, and here we have Osgoode Hall, where he went to law school in Toronto, it was assumed that Antoinette would accompany him, right? One would think that the wife would go along with the husband, but for some reason, Oscar's parents convinced him to have Antoinette stay back in Windsor while he would go, perhaps, so that he could concentrate on his studies. Perhaps they were trying to install a wedge between them. We're not exactly sure why she stayed back, but when she stayed back and stayed with her parent or his parents, a lot of the tension started to come to the surface. So she accused Oscar pretty much of lying to her, and all these promises were being unfulfilled. So that's one of the reasons why she left. Another reason, Melinda, kind of what you had said as well, she was disappointed in Windsor and Detroit. It was not home. She had envisioned perhaps, opening boutiques in Windsor and Detroit, but the area was not ready for the Chanel fashion quite yet. So although Windsor and Detroit had a lot to offer, it was not Paris, the fashion capital of the world, and that's where all her loved ones were, and she didn't have that. Here's a quote from the book. We showed them day clothes, sports clothes. The stores could carry the collection while I found a spot for a boutique, but the reaction everywhere was the same. Women here never wear clothes like that. Detroit, it turned out, was nothing like Paris. So if we take a picture, a look at the picture over here on the left-hand side, this is the familiar silhouette that was popularized and almost invented by Coco Chanel and Antoinette. You have almost this boyish silhouette where in that postcard we were looking at, we still had that hourglass, little tiny waist, was not very functional. Coco Chanel wanted to revolutionize the fashion world to make it beautiful but functional. So here that loosened up silhouette gave the women more movement. You could see that the skirts were quite a bit shorter here, just a little bit below the knee. Also, the fabric it was made out of. In the book, I think it had mentioned that the fabric was the same fabric that they used to make their underwear. So this was a fabric that was more informal. It was sportswear. And unfortunately, at that time, it was just perhaps maybe too cutting edge for the area for Windsor, Detroit. Gradually, I think they did warm up to the style. But this was coming off, hot off out of the boutiques of Coco Chanel. So unfortunately, Antoinette was not able to sell any of this clothing. And she also had, as we know, she became rich from her hats. She had a hat boutique in Paris. And again, the hats were just not selling like she thought or that they should have. Gradually they did catch on, but at that time she was disappointed. And also she was a businesswoman. She missed that business side to her job, and she was kind of forced to stay home, and she didn't have too many hobbies happening because she was expected a newly married woman. She was, going to set up a household eventually. She was learning, and that is what she would spend her days doing. So unfortunately, the business side, I think she missed, and that was perhaps another reason why she left Windsor. And lastly, so lastly, there's the tensions between the Franco community and the Anglo, so the French and the English. Again, a little quote from the book. And there was the fact that Windsor, as Oscar explained, had started out as a French colony until the British took over. There were two rival factions in town, the Anglo-Protestant like his family and the French Catholics like me. I was turning out to be the family scandal. So here's another reason. She's coming in as a French Catholic marrying into an English Protestant family. Scandalous, very scandalous. So if you take a look here, we have Church of the Ascension, which is now on University Avenue, still there. It has, I believe, burnt down a couple times, but the cornerstone, the original cornerstone, is still there, and there's a plaque explaining the story of the church, and that's where the Fleming family would have worship. So that would be the Protestant side. And then, of course, Our Lady of the Assumption Church, right by the Ambassador Bridge, the oldest parish in Canada. That would have been, if Antoinette had gone to church or to worship, we would assume it would have been here, but there's no evidence that she did while she was there. And thankfully, Our Lady of the Assumption Church is going through some renovations to preserve it, because it is such a big part of our heritage, and that project is coming along nicely. Now, also the influx of the Franco-Canadian population in Ontario, due to industry such as we had the nickel mines up in Sudbury, and of course Golden Timmins, the forestry industry, paper industry, Northern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, and even in Windsor we had the auto industry. Ontario was in need of laborers. And because of that, we had a rather large Franco-Canadian population that came into Ontario. And I think a lot of Ontarians at that time were viewing that as a threat, perhaps a little bit concerned that they would lose their culture, the French would take over. That didn't happen. I don't think it was close to happening, but they did feel that threat. Because of that, Regulation 17 was put in place. So that was from 1912 to 1927. And this was implemented by the Conservative government. It forbade teaching French or in French beyond grade 2 in all separate schools. They were allowed 1 hour of French instruction a day. And that was it. Other than that, teachers could not teach in French. If you think about it, in our society with our modern schools here, it would be like unfortunate, but it wouldn't be seen as, a direct attack perhaps. But back in the day, think about it, we had little French communities everywhere. We had French pockets out in St. Joachim, in Belle River. Riverside had a little French community, Rivière-au-Canard. And in these communities, essentially the first language was French. So all the children going to school were speaking French. The teachers teaching in those schools were teaching French as well. but they were not allowed to speak French or teach in French. So they would have to use a second language, English, to learn and to educate, which seems kind of, you know, in a way, it's just counterproductive. So that became a big problem. Obviously, the French community had a big problem with that. So because of that, because of Regulation 17, young Franco-Canadian men refused to enlist in World War I, and that was called the conscription crisis of 1917. So here you will see we have some propaganda, and this is targeting the French population. So the poster on the left, this poster appears to have come from the area of Sherbrooke, Quebec, or the Montreal area. And it's kind of, you know, entendrons-nous que les nôtres brûlent, bataillon canadien français. So here they're, you know, French pride, we have to preserve our culture, let's go to war kind of propaganda. And over here on the right, this was more for Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario. I particularly like the up here where it says les purs Canadiens, right? With the dialect of the day used up in those in those communities. So these are examples of propaganda. I could not find anything from the Windsor area, but I'm sure that, you know, something existed for the French Canadians down here. So the Flemings would have been aware of all this, this crisis of Regulation 17, and this would have contributed towards their view with Antoinette. Antoinette, you know, they didn't distinguish the difference between French Canadian and Parisian French. She was French, so that means she probably believed the same things as the French Canadians. She was a threat, and that is why they kind of saw her marriage as scandalous. So ultimately, Antoinette packed up, and after a year with Oscar, she left him and moved on in her journey. Which is sad.
With these posters, I think about how the French Canadians are being encouraged to go and fight the war to protect France. So the Anglo-Canadians are being encouraged because we're British subjects and we're protecting Mother England. But the French Canadians are being encouraged to protect France. And perhaps that's even another wedge that's being driven in Anglo-Franco relations is that
absolutely.
You're not protecting the Anglos, you're protecting the Francos.
Yeah, definitely. So quite tragic. And then, so to put an end to this, you know, Regulation 17. So because obviously now in our area, the French community is thriving. We have two wonderful French boards. We have the French Catholic Board, Conseil Scolaire Catholique Providence, and then we have Via Monde, that would be the French Public Board. French immersion programs throughout the other boards are, you know, they're at capacity, they're building new schools, so that's wonderful. So what happened, and it's kind of, you know, a little bit ironic perhaps, Battle of the Hat Pins. So when Antoinette first came here, remember, she made her fortune by first making hats, and that was her thing, making hats, designing hats, and her hats gave her success and gave her money. And here we have the Battle of the Hat Pins, which in fact is, well, we will watch the video and you will see what the Battle of the Hat Pins is all about.
In 1912, the Government of Ontario issued a regulation limiting French language teaching. Under Regulation 17, educators were permitted to teach in French just 1 hour a day, and only for the first 2 years of elementary school. The law was created in response to an influx of Francophones to Ontario. It enraged the Francophone communities, and eventually 2 sisters decided to resist. Beatrice and Diane Desloges began teaching at the Gigue School in Ottawa in September of 1915. Immediately, they rejected Regulation 17 and continued to teach in French. The Petite Commission acting for the school board threatened to revoke their diplomas. Undaunted, the sisters persisted until the board stopped paying them and hired replacement teachers. Several parents withdrew their children from Gigue, and the sisters began teaching in makeshift classrooms. But by January 1916, parents were fed up with the conditions in which their children were being educated and protested the government. On January 4th, 1916, 70 mothers, armed with hatpins, scissors, and other objects, occupied the Gigue School to reinstate Beatrice and Diane, while 50 fathers stood guard outside. Tensions reached a boiling point on the morning of January 7th, when police set up a blockade to prevent the sisters from entering the school. Francophone parents pushed their way through the blockade and helped the sisters enter the school through an open window. The mothers were dubbed les gardiennes de Guigues. They protected the school for several weeks after the initial Battle of the Hatpins, allowing Beatrice and Diane to conduct classes freely. These events sparked further protests. Thousands of students took to the streets in an ongoing show of resistance in Ottawa. Protests continued into the spring, and les gardiennes de Guigues remained on watch until June.
So there we have it, the Battle of the Hat Pins. I really do like the fact that they use hat pins as weapons, right? A little bit of poking happening, but look what they accomplished. And here we are today with, like I said, thriving school boards and a great, thriving French community. Yeah.
So the footnote to the story is that Oscar Edward Fleming married someone else. So Antoinette left Windsor when, the fictionalized account tells us a bit about why she chose to do that. We do know that she died in Buenos Aires sometime later, and she died of tuberculosis. So after she died, obviously Oscar Edward was free to remarry, and he married Irene Fairclough. Now, what's interesting is that you see on the left over here this tiny little ad in the Border City Star announcing the marriage of Antoinette Chanel to Oscar Edward Fleming in 1919, and on the right we have this gigantic society page celebrating Mrs. Oscar Fleming Jr. With marrying Irene Fairclough, and it was quite the society event, that marriage. It's clearly the family were happier with Irene than they were. So that's kind of takes us to the end of our James Walk, and as we mentioned, that we were inspired by this story of Antoinette Chanel coming to Windsor to learn all kinds of things none of us really knew about our own community. And that's really the basis for Jane's Walks, is that Jane Jacobs was a self-taught urban planner. She lived in New York City for some time, then she moved to Toronto. And in New York City, she was responsible for ensuring that there wasn't a great big highway through the middle of New York City. And similarly in Toronto, she was part of making sure that Spadina Avenue didn't turn into a freeway. And in her memory, in her honor, around the world, there are walks held by self-taught urban planners, if you will, people who have an interest in their community and who want to share with their neighbors and friends the things they're learning about their community. And Windsor has a number of Jane's Walks taking place in the weekend of May 7th to May 9th. And you can find more of those at www.windsorjaneswalk.ca. And we want to thank, first of all, these three huge sources that were really valuable to us, our Digital World, the Southwest Ontario Digital Archive, and the University of Windsor's Modern Girl Digital Archive. I think Candace wound up so far down the rabbit hole on some of the newspapers, they still not have her back.
It's a new way of creeping, I guess. It was fun.
And we have a number, just to quickly dash through some of our references, the books and the articles and the websites that we went to find out information about our community. And we're very happy to have a conversation with some other members of the book club, and also Sarah Morris there in the middle, who is the organizer of the Jane's Walks.
So Jennifer and Sarah, any thoughts? Anything that excited you about all of that?
There's a lot of wow moments in there. That was really impressive. Well done, everyone. My question to you all who did all that research, what legacy do you think remains from the 1920s today in the city?
Well, I mean, I think our history, we certainly take a great deal of pride in ourselves as rum runners. We were about to build this new district, the whiskey, the distillery district. We're going to rename Walkerville as the distillery district. So certainly we take some pride in all of that. Perhaps some of our commitment to being Detroit facing, and we've cleaned up the riverfront so that we can spend time on the riverfront reflecting on our relationship to Detroit. I don't know, other people, what do you think?
I think also like the French heritage and preserving that French heritage is very important. I was fortunate enough, I was raised in, I went to the French Catholic School Board where they tell us a lot of that things that perhaps isn't common knowledge. So, you know, the Battle of the Hat Pins, that's something I grew up with, that's something I knew, Règlement 17, I knew about that. But beyond that, looking at Windsor as a whole, of course, all the city street names, but there's such a French legacy. And throughout our community in Windsor-Essex, we still have those pockets of, you know, French communities that I think we should preserve and cherish. And you know, same with our school boards, right? It's very encouraging. Also, I'm lucky enough to teach in one of these school boards, and it's wonderful to preserve that culture and to foster it and to encourage and to welcome. Our culture is gradually changing a little bit because we are welcoming newcomers to Canada where their first language is French. So they are bringing us more culture. They are bringing us more ideas and more you know, reasons to celebrate. So I think that is one of the legacies, you know, to keep going with that.
Debbie, I saw you had your hand up.
Oh, I was going to refer to some of the rum running stories. And I grew up, we had a cottage in Bell River, and there was a restaurant there called Cooper's Court. And there were all kinds of stories of all the tunnel systems that were underneath and in Bell River, and, you know, Al Capone. And there's a church at the corner near on Riverside Drive. It's now been made into a reception hall. We've sung there before. It's got a big cross on the top of it, and apparently we were told one day that Al Capone's people, when it was clear for them to drive across the frozen Detroit River, the cross would face one way, but if it wasn't clear, they would turn the cross and face it another way. So there were all these kind of symbols and warnings and things like that, and you know, about that era. And we did a tour when one of our book girls, Lisa, got married through the Hiram Walker, and it was really interesting that they talked about. A couple of things I learned were, you know, how when they would go across, they would have crates full of salt with the bottles, and if the cops were coming, they would drop it into the water and it would sink. But as the raid went on or whatever, and then all the salt would dissipate, and then soon it would float back up to the top so they could get it. And just different stories of women stashing bottles under their skirts, and so there's just a lot of history about that kind of life going on here in Windsor. So
I loved how there's so much in the presentation. I mean, you have everything from prohibition to it was really fun to hear about the fashion and to think more about what women's lives were like at that time here. And I like that you explored, you know, what might they have done for fun, where would they have gone, and then getting into the whole French connection and everything and the history there. I mean, it's just, there's something for everybody in this.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's really great.
Imagine how different our area would have been if Cocoa or if Antoinette had, you know, started another empire here. Imagine how different Windsor and Detroit would be, right?
Yeah, it's just so amazing that nobody really knows that story, but in fact, there it is, you know. And as someone who's just recently started to learn French, or take that grade 3 French from 1970 and do something with it. The French history of the community is really much more meaningful to me now than it used to be, and kind of thinking about the layering of that French history onto the existing Indigenous history, and then the layering of the English, the Anglophone history onto that, and so it's one of the incredible bits of richness of this community, in fact, is that it's got this, all of this aspect to it, and that it's still really strong, and people still work very hard to make sure that French history is maintained. And it has this wonderful accent. I mean, I confess that sometimes in my French classes, if there's somebody who's a local French speaker, I do struggle to understand what they're saying. However, I'm getting better at that.
It's a regional accent. Even like people from Northern Ontario, when they hear our accent down here, our regional accent, they can't understand us. So
like some fun facts about our accent.
Fun fact,
So
sure.
I consider myself a Franco-Ontarian. Morris is a fake name in a lot of ways. Morris is Morozovich on my dad's side, but I'm a Leboeuf on my mom's side, and sometimes we really roll our R's. So you could probably hear that from how some people speak, but that apparently that's a way that religious leaders used to speak. And that was a very like priestly way to talk, is to take that sounded very priestly at the time. And I spoke to someone from France who studied the French language, and he says, you guys sound so old-fashioned when you speak, as that had been sort of a holdover of wanting to sound more Catholic and religieux and all that, that we really roll our R's. So I love our accent. I love that it's kind of hick and kind of fun. And I think accents really tell a story. And that, radiator leaders of Canada. And I love when I hear a beautiful Northern Ontario French. I love a good hick Quebecois accent. I love them all. So I'm very proud of my muskrat French. And do you guys know the term muskrat French? So that's the term for Franco-Ontarians from near Windsor, because during Lent, the French here would eat muskrats. So that's, was maybe used as a derogatory term, but I know a lot of people who want to reclaim that term as something fun, that we're muskrat French.
It's interesting. I wonder what Antoinette would have thought. Like, so Antoinette, she writes her and she's unilingual Francophone. She says in the author of the book says she's a tiny bit of French, or a tiny bit of English rather. So she arrives to Windsor in the 1920s, and perhaps the accent would have been even more regional.
Way worse, because Radio Canada wouldn't have been around,
yeah. And you wouldn't have had so much influx of people from other parts of the world. So I wonder if she even felt alienated from the French.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Probably.
Yeah.
I was once reading a book about all the different French, like it was Les Contes de Détroits, which is all about fairy tales from Detroit and the Detroit region. And the first chapter is explaining all the weird anomalies of the French language from the area. And I was reading, I'm like, that just sounds like my grandma. I don't know.
Yeah.
This is we need a whole chapter on this.
Yeah. Another way, like you said, it's an old-fashioned type French. And another reason why is because here in Southern Ontario, we're kind of isolated from, say, the larger communities up in Northern Ontario. So you have Northern Ontario, you have Quebec, who all kind of, not too far from each other. And then you have this very large gap where there's hardly any, you go through the GTA, there's not too many French communities. And then we're like, oh, hey, here we are. So as the rest of the language was evolving down here in Windsor-Essex, our language didn't evolve. So that's why we have words like when we're talking about a car, we say, en bac dans le char, right? Because you don't use that anywhere else except in Windsor and Essex, because our language didn't evolve in the same way. So it's very interesting. I read that book, which is, it explains a little bit of all that stuff, which is really good. Melinda, you should read it.
Point. It's like, en bac dans le char, say it's two different things.
Yes.
En bac is like ship terminology. So you're embarking like you would on a ship.
Yep.
Shawl is like a carriage.
Yep.
And that's how
and yet that's how we talk.
In the year of our Lord 2021.
Well, if you
It's
look at England,
fascinating.
though, England, you go around and it's like for the Anglo people to understand better, you go around England and you can see, and this is a small island comparatively, and they really judge on where you come from and what your accent is. So that really makes a difference there.
Yeah.
Very
Ideas for the next walk.
Yeah, this has been so fabulous to hear all of your wonderful research that you all did. Like I said, I had a lot of wow moments, including the 105-year-old grandmother. That's incredible.
Yeah. Isn't that incredible? And
That's awesome.
she's still around.
Yeah. Anna says she talks to her a couple, I think a couple times a month, and she's still very interactive and engaging over the telephone, and so that's pretty incredible. And I think the one thing that I really appreciated is because doing the research even created opportunities for me to have conversations with my parents. Like, I didn't know that my grandmother was a manager of one of the Smith stores, and I feel like just like sharing like family stories and history is so important. And like let's keep talking and making records of these interactions. And like Anna's very fortunate she can still have those conversations with her grandma, and our community is very fortunate that some of those women were interviewed, and we have an archive to refer to. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I took away from this project was, keep asking questions and talking, and then share that information with the next generation too, right? So
Oh my goodness, I go out with my mom. She grew up in Harrow, and when she moved to Windsor to go to nursing school, my grandmother thought she would never see her again because it was so far away. And she, tells story whenever we drive out there, it's, oh, that's so-and-so's house. That's where we used to bring all of our clothes that we were worn out. And she used to make blankets with them. And, oh, this is where so-and-so. And like, I just drink it in, of all of the knowledge that she has of the Harrow area and what it was and what it, when quick little side note, when she was young, she was going up to Toronto to visit her brother. And my grandfather asked a trucker at the feed store, because they were all farmers, if he would give his 17-year-old daughter, or 12 or 13, or I don't know how old she was, 14, if he would give her a ride up to Toronto. And my grandfather had no idea who he was, but he was a trucker going on the highway going to Toronto. So yeah, take my daughter up there and she'll meet up with her brother. It was a bit of a different world back then.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Sarah Morris, for making this opportunity possible for us too. We were so excited, and it's just been such a great time, and we look forward to seeing all the other Jane's Walks too.
Thank you all so much. It's been fabulous.
All right.